Hollywood's greatest commercial catastrophes have a habit of becoming the medium's most fiercely protected secrets. The decade of the 1960s was populated by ambitious, forward-thinking filmmakers who self-destructed at the ticket window while quietly assembling movies that would survive everything that overshadowed them. One entry on this list was captured on camera during an actual military occupation. Another was so unconventional that not a single American distribution company would go near it for years on end. And one ignited a national controversy so devastating that a foreign government stepped in with an outright prohibition. What follows are 15 overlooked films from the 1960s that collapsed commercially but have never stopped being worth your time. Arriving at position 15, we begin with Faces, from 1968. Long before John Cassavetes earned his reputation as the founding father of American independent filmmaking, he delivered this unsparing, nakedly honest portrait of a comfortable marriage disintegrating before your eyes. A prosperous businessman walks away from his wife after a lifetime together, and everything that comes after is composed of alcohol-soaked confessions, empty social laughter, and two people communicating everything through what remains unsaid. Photographed in coarse black and white on 16mm stock inside Cassavetes's personal residence, the result carries the unmistakable texture of a documentary crew that stumbled upon a genuine domestic collapse. The making of it was its own kind of productive chaos. Cassavetes bankrolled the entire project himself across 3 full years, grabbing footage on evenings and weekends with a bare-bones crew and performers who functioned somewhere between artistic partners and willing test subjects. His wife Gina Rowlands and his inner circle of friends populate the film throughout, and the boundary separating genuine feeling from staged performance was something Cassavetes routinely and deliberately dissolved. He developed a habit of running the cameras well past any reasonable endpoint of a scene, harvesting instants of authentic unease that no studio-employed script overseer would have tolerated for a moment. When the completed film reached audiences expecting recognizable dramatic conventions, the bewilderment was total. Its opening run generated under $200,000, and the critics who championed it possessed no power to pull reluctant general viewers through theater doors. The film occupied a peculiar middle ground that satisfied nobody. Too emotionally exposed for cerebral audiences, too unpolished and confrontational for mainstream ones. The passage of time has settled the argument decisively in Cassavetes's favor. Martin Scorsese has described Cassavetes as the solitary American filmmaker of that generation who operated with genuine liberty, and Faces stands as the most transparent demonstration of what that liberty actually produced. Every director who has subsequently aimed a lens at unscripted human truth, whether working in the mumblecore tradition or anywhere else on the independent spectrum, carries a debt to this picture. As a document of unmediated human experience preserved on film, Faces remains without equal. Position 14 belongs to Hombre, from 1967. Paul Newman inhabits a white man raised within Apache culture who finds himself obligated to shepherd a stagecoach full of passengers across dangerous terrain, passengers who hold him in open contempt. On the surface it presents as a familiar Western arrangement, but filmmaker Martin Ritt reshapes it into something considerably more unsettling. The character Newman portrays is measured, deliberate, and thoroughly indifferent to the performance of nobility on behalf of people who would extend him no basic human courtesy. The filmmaking process itself was less turbulent than many productions in this collection, but the completed work immediately generated friction with studio executives who could locate no precedent for promoting a Western in which the central figure nursed active disdain for the very people he was protecting. Newman occupied the uppermost tier of Hollywood celebrity at this moment, having recently completed Cool Hand Luke and The Hustler, and United Artists had constructed their expectations around something accessible and broadly appealing. What materialized instead was a philosophical argument dressed in the clothing of a genre entertainment. The returns at the box office were adequate but fell far short of what the studio had projected, failing entirely to reach the expansive audience they had counted on. Critical opinion fractured. A portion of reviewers detected something genuinely valuable, while others concluded it was simply too emotionally remote to forge any real connection. In the cultural context of 1967, American moviegoers retained strong expectations about what a Western was supposed to feel like, and Hombre had no interest in meeting them. Encounter it today and the experience is fundamentally different. The critic Richard Schickel eventually identified it as one of the most truthful cinematic examinations of race and the constructed mythology of America that the Western form has ever contained. Newman communicates everything essential through restraint and stillness, and the closing passage of the story carries a moral gravity that most films running twice its duration never approach. For anyone genuinely curious about what the Western genre looks like when it commits fully to honesty, this film provides the answer. 13th position goes to The Incident, from 1967. Two aggressive young men climb aboard a late-night subway train in New York City and spend the entire film's duration tormenting the other passengers. That description encompasses essentially the whole of the premise, yet it generates one of the most claustrophobically oppressive viewing experiences the entire decade has to offer. The captive riders represent a carefully assembled cross-section of the anxieties circulating through 1960s America. Returning servicemen, recent immigrants, a man concealing his sexuality, an aging married couple, and the camera observes with patient, unblinking attention as every single one of them chooses an action. Director Larry Pierce constructed the film on location inside functioning New York subway carriages, working with a cast that featured Martin Sheen in one of his earliest prominent performances. The conditions of production were genuinely punishing, confined, sweltering, and technically demanding at every turn, and the psychological pressure generated by the material seeped beyond the edges of the frame and into the atmosphere of the shoot itself. Multiple members of the cast acknowledged afterward that the experience left a residue of genuine disturbance that required considerable time to dissolve. Fox found themselves holding something they had no framework for positioning in the marketplace. Their promotional approach emphasized suspense and danger, but The Incident is not fundamentally a thriller. It is a dissection of moral paralysis. Viewers who arrived expecting escalating tension followed by resolution received escalating tension followed by a mirror. Commercial results were weak, and the film vanished from circulation almost immediately. What renders it essential viewing now is identical to what rendered it commercially impossible then. The Incident is a meditation on complicity, on the elaborate internal narratives through which ordinary people justify their refusal to act when intervention is demanded. Half a century later, that central argument has only grown in its urgency and applicability. Tony Musonti and Martin Sheen generate genuine menace throughout, but the passengers are what stay with you after the film ends. Number 12 is The Charge of the Light Brigade, from 1968. Tony Richardson, arriving fresh from his Academy Award victory for Tom Jones, gathered an extraordinary ensemble: David Hemmings, Vanessa Redgrave, John Gielgud, Trevor Howard, and set himself the task of constructing the authoritative cinematic account of Britain's most catastrophic and celebrated military blunder. What he produced was intentionally abrasive, structurally fragmented, and consumed with rage toward the sentimental fictions that had grown up around martial sacrifice. The production tested everyone involved to their limits. The company filmed in Turkey under punishing physical conditions, running dramatically over both the scheduled time frame and the allocated budget. Richardson found himself in perpetual conflict with the producing team over questions of running time and the film's savage satirical register. The physical demands of staging the battle sequences created genuine danger, and the interpersonal tensions among members of the cast generated an atmosphere of real hostility on set. United Artists had assembled their hopes around something possessing the sweep and grandeur of Lawrence of Arabia. What Richardson delivered was something closer to a controlled demolition of that entire tradition of romanticized military spectacle. Critical reception was split, with many reviewers finding the jagged editorial rhythm and unrelenting irony more exhausting than illuminating. The commercial performance was deeply disappointing, recovering only a small portion of its substantial investment. Among those who examined it with care was Stanley Kubrick. The specific techniques Richardson employed, the integration of period satirical illustration as running commentary, the systematic puncturing of heroic iconography, anticipate Full Metal Jacket with a precision that becomes increasingly apparent on close viewing. For any serious student of how British cinema undertook the project of dismantling its own mythology of empire from within, this film is indispensable. 11th on the list is Targets, also from 1968. Peter Bogdanovich announced himself as a director with this genuinely unsettling debut, constructed around two parallel narrative threads. An aging horror film performer played by Boris Karloff who has begun to feel like a relic in an unrecognizable world, and a clean-cut, apparently ordinary young man who one day begins shooting strangers. The moment the two threads converge at a drive-in movie theater, the effect lands with a quiet, devastating precision. Bogdanovich assembled the picture under the producing auspices of Roger Corman on a total budget of approximately $130,000, incorporating unused material from an earlier Karloff production and completing principal photography across 15 days. Karloff contributed 20 days of his time without compensation as an act of personal generosity. The film reached its finished state before James Earl Ray pulled the trigger in Memphis and Sirhan Sirhan in Los Angeles, but it entered theaters into a country freshly shattered by exactly the violence it had been examining. Paramount's commitment to releasing it was minimal at best. A film constructed with this degree of quiet and this degree of directness about American gun violence possessed no clearly defined audience in 1968, arriving as it did in the immediate shadow of national bereavement. It generated almost no revenue and exited theaters with remarkable speed. What Bogdanovich achieved within those financial and temporal constraints continues to provoke genuine amazement. Targets remains among the most penetrating films ever produced about the distinctly American catastrophe of mass violence. A catastrophe shown here to originate not in deprivation or diagnosable illness but in the silent, spreading vacancy at the center of a prosperous suburban existence. Karloff's work in his final substantial role achieves something close to heartbreak. This film has earned the widest possible audience. At number 10 we find Point Blank, from 1967. Lee Marvin portrays a man who survives being shot and abandoned and subsequently returns to recover the money he is owed. And from that point forward almost nothing in the film operates according to conventional expectations. Director John Boorman, undertaking his inaugural American production, took what the studio understood to be a lean crime thriller and transformed it into something closer to a waking hallucination. Timelines that refuse linear sequence, imagery with the logic of dreams, and a central character whose existence as a living person rather than a purposeful apparition the film never quite confirms. The battle over the finished product was substantial. MGM had commissioned a straightforward action picture. Boorman's ambition was the systematic dissolution of the genre's foundational assumptions. Lee Marvin, commanding enormous industry leverage in the immediate wake of his success in Cat Ballou, deployed that leverage in full support of Boorman, and the two of them pushed back against studio resistance at virtually every stage of the process. The film that reached screens bore almost no resemblance to what the studio's development process had sanctioned. Box office performance was poor, and the critical establishment, oriented toward genre payoff and narrative resolution, found itself confounded and largely unreceptive. The minority who grasped what Boorman had accomplished went largely unheard. The film disappeared. Quentin Tarantino has identified Point Blank as one of the foundational texts that taught him what the crime film was actually capable of. And Steven Soderbergh's sustained career-long engagement with formal experimentation carries unmistakable traces of what Boorman constructed here. The sequence in which Marvin walks, that particular walk through that particular corridor, stands as one of the defining images the decade produced in any genre. The film improves with every encounter. Number 9 is The Thomas Crown Affair, from 1968. Steve McQueen plays an extremely wealthy man who executes a bank robbery purely for the intellectual and aesthetic satisfaction of executing it perfectly, while Faye Dunaway plays the insurance investigator who has no doubt whatsoever about his guilt and remains genuinely uncertain whether that knowledge obligates her to act on it. Director Norman Jewison encased this material in split-screen compositions, a jazz-inflected score, and a game of chess that functions as one of the most erotically loaded sequences the decade committed to film. The production proceeded without unusual difficulty, but the finished work materialized in a commercial environment with no clear category to receive it. It possessed too much surface elegance for a straightforward thriller, too much emotional coolness for a romance, and too much moral ambiguity to offer mainstream audiences any comfortable foothold. The chess sequence attracted accusations of impropriety from certain critics, a reaction that communicates considerably more about the cultural moment of 1968 than it does about the film. The commercial return was moderate rather than strong, falling short of what United Artists had anticipated given the combined drawing power of the two leads. The film accumulated its following incrementally, through the experience of viewers who returned to it repeatedly and found themselves unable to fully account for the compulsion. What persists is the film's quality of surface, the evident pleasure Juison takes in how things look and how two people sound when they are circling each other without admitting it. Michel Legrand's musical contribution ranks among the finest work of his career. The dynamic between McQueen and Dunaway operates according to principles that resist analytical reduction and probably always will. As a work of pure cinematic pleasure, it has no superior from the decade that produced it. Position 8 is occupied by Reflections in a Golden Eye, from 1967. Director John Huston brought together Marlon Brando and Elizabeth Taylor for an adaptation of Carson McCullers' novel exploring suppressed longing, obsessive fixation, and the slow accumulation of violence on a peacetime American military installation. Brando's character is an officer whose innermost desires are entirely without name or permissible expression, while Taylor's is a wife whose cruelty toward him operates with a casualness that suggests complete indifference to consequence. The entire production was photographed through a processing technique that bathes every frame in a warm golden saturation, producing an effect closer to the surface texture of a fever state memory than to conventional photographic representation. The working environment was as unstable as the subject matter demanded. Brando and Huston maintained a relationship of complex and wary mutual respect that periodically collapsed into open friction. Taylor, arriving on set in the immediate aftermath of severe personal upheaval, carried a quality of recklessness into her performance that Huston could harness but never fully direct. The golden tint provoked sufficient discomfort among exhibitors that a significant number of theaters simply removed it from the print, projecting a version that bore no relationship to anything its director had authorized or intended. Warner Brothers' anxiety about the film's thematic content, its treatment of homosexual desire, voyeurism, and violence presented without the reassurance of moral framing, translated directly into a promotional effort so subdued as to constitute near invisibility. Critical opinion was fractured and frequently hostile. The financial result was a meaningful loss, and Huston later numbered it among the most painful chapters of his professional life. Considered against the trajectory of what American cinema was moving toward in the decade that followed, Reflections in a Golden Eye emerges as a direct ancestor of the psychological intricacy that would come to define the 1970s. Brando's performance exists in a register entirely separate from everything else in his body of work. The film continues to operate on the viewer long after the screening ends, in ways that are simultaneously resistant to articulation and impossible to set aside. Number 7 is Joanna, from 1968. A young woman studying art makes her way to London, experiences love, sustains loss, and moves forward. Michael Sarne's film is exuberant, saturated with color, and thoroughly enamored of its own cultural moment, while simultaneously carrying, beneath all of that psychedelic surface energy, a genuine and quietly devastating awareness of what it costs to inhabit the present tense with complete commitment. The picture was assembled on a limited budget but with extraordinary visual intelligence, Sarne approaching the streets of London as a painter approaches an unprimed canvas, constructing each frame as an accumulation of movement, color, and vitality. The performance Genevieve Waite delivers in the central role stands as one of the decade's most unjustly overlooked. She is entirely present in every moment, slightly displaced from ordinary reality, and completely persuasive as a person to whom beauty and grief arrive with equal and undifferentiated intensity. Fox had positioned themselves to receive a crowd-pleasing commercial return riding the wave of international fascination with Swinging London, and were genuinely disoriented when the film's emotional undertow kept audiences from committing to it. The returns were minimal, and critical reception consigned it to the category of charming period artifact, a document of a specific cultural moment without sufficient intrinsic craft to outlast it. That verdict has not survived contact with time. Joanna is among the most visually alive productions the decade generated, and Waite's work reveals additional dimensions with every subsequent viewing. For anyone seeking genuine immersion in what London in 1968 felt like as a living experience rather than a retrospective aesthetic category, this film provides the closest available approximation. Sixth place belongs to The Naked Prey from 1965. Actor-director Cornel Wilde cast himself as a safari expedition guide in colonial-era Africa, who, after his employer fatally offends a local tribe, is stripped of every material possession and given a running head start before the pursuit begins. For a substantial portion of its running time, the film operates as pure physical experience. Movement, terrain, heat, and the radical simplification of a human consciousness to a single overriding biological imperative. Wilde conducted the entire production on location in southern Africa with a minimal crew and what can only be described as a commitment to physical authenticity that bordered on recklessness. He covered those actual landscapes himself under those actual conditions, without the mediation of stand-ins, and the bodily reality of what unfolds on screen is not a matter of cinematic illusion. The community members who appear throughout were not drawn from the professional acting pool, and their presence generates a sense of weight and authentic human dignity that studio casting procedures could never have approximated. Paramount found themselves holding a film that resisted every available commercial template. It was neither straightforwardly celebratory of its protagonist's survival nor straightforwardly critical of the colonial framework that produced the conflict. A modest commercial return materialized, but nothing approaching the audience the film's qualities warranted.